So next up, we're going to look at the European charging landscape from a legal standpoint. I am joined by Thea Tyvold from CMS Norway and Gerd Leutner from CMS Germany. CMS is a law firm and its lawyers work for different industry and are active in more than 40 countries, meaning that some, but not all of these countries are located in the European Union. So why do I mention that? Well, as Marcus already mentioned, well, there's this little thing called the European Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, AFIR, that took effect just a few days ago. And I'm going to leave it to the experts to explain the details as well as what that means for the different countries. I don't know who of you two is going to start. Gerd, I think we'll start with you, correct? Okay, stage is yours.
Thank you, Carla. And you already took away from me the tedious task of spelling out the long name of this regulation that we're talking about. First of all, I would like to introduce our CMS EV task force, which Antje Becker and I kicked off back in 2010, and which since then has grown internationally. A few of our team members are here to show you a few examples of specific countries. And it was particularly nice to have Marcus Goll speaking before me, because he showed with Ionity what seamless charging throughout Europe can be. Ionity already has this mission and does it quite well, I think. So the AFIR, the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, was adopted in September last year, and it came into effect a few days ago on April 13th, 2024. It is, so to speak, a detailed roadmap with enforceable rules, and it repeals an earlier directive from 2014. And as you know, directives under European law are not binding upon market players, but they are binding upon the states only who have to transpose them into national law. Now we have a directive here with the AFIR, and it's therefore directly applicable law. It's not in all its parts as clear as one could wish, but I think that's also due to the fact that the industry is evolving, technology is evolving, and it's hard to define or to use very well and detailed defined notions. For some clarification, the EU Commission has published a few days ago a very detailed 10-page Q&A that explains some of these notions, but one must say not all the explanations really are conclusive. So very often it's said it depends on case-to-case appreciation, but at least we get some light on the notions of renovated or what a payment card is, for example. I find it noteworthy that the AFIR was adopted in the context of a larger overarching program, which is called Fit for 55, which is intended to be the basis for a sustainable energy future of the European Union. And now, if we look at the notion of alternative fuel, which gives the regulation its name, that does not yet say whether the alternative fuel is indeed sustainable. And sustainability, of course, depends to a large extent on the energy mix that is used in a given situation. If you have a dirty mix, then the fuel or energy source may be alternative, but it's not clear nor sustainable in that case. In this case, the chimneys, pipes simply smoke somewhere else. But at best, AFIR may prepare the infrastructure of fuels that will become over time more and more sustainable, so that ultimately alternative hopefully will mean clean. And we heard from Marcus Goll that Ionity already delivers this target, so it's up to market players to do what they can. As I said, AFIR is directly and immediately enforceable and applicable. We don't need any transposition law in principle. In fact, we do need some because member states have to fulfill certain roles under the AFIR and will have to enact rules for their national environment. That is one of the obligations under the AFIR. Who is obliged under AFIR? It is above all the member states, and on the other hand, specific market players in the area of EV charging. It's charge point operators and mobility service providers. And here it's interesting to see that MSPs, mobility service providers, are addressed for the first time as a specific category of market players. And you can see by that that AFIR sort of reflects the evolution of the EV charging ecosystem, and also the players that it's composed of and the technology that is used. Let me go beyond the agenda into details of the AFIR basics. In terms of timelines, let me give you a few selected key timelines. As a principle, all the obligations start from April 13th, 2024, unless the AFIR sets a later deadline. For the member states, that means above all that they have to provide a draft policy framework, national policy framework, by end of December of this year. From our contacts with the German Federal Ministry for Digital Matters and Traffic, we understand that they are working on it. So hopefully we'll deliver on time. And this is to be followed and of course to be accompanied by market players as well. For the CPOs, one deadline is that as of April 25, they must provide static and dynamic data relating to charge points that they operate to a newly created or identification registration organization, also named IDRO. We know similar things from the national legal frameworks. I will come to that later. But this is the new common European headline for this provision of data and exchange of data. Publicly accessible new installations must immediately comply with the technical requirements that the AFIR sets out in Article 5, in particular payment service features. And publicly accessible charge points must be digitally connected by mid of October of this year. All fast charging points along the TNT road network, or that are placed in safe and secure parking areas, need to be equipped the same way by January 1, 2027. So those were a few key timelines, but if no timeline is set, then the AFIR is enforceable right away. And speaking of enforcement, who enforces AFIR? For the CPO and MSP obligations, there is no real enforcement mechanism. Member states must monitor the market and must monitor possibly unfair commercial practices that would affect the consumers. So this gives some room for competition authorities to investigate. Now, a look at possible impact for market players. In Germany, we have basically to look at Article 5 out of the 47 pages that the AFIR contains. So I have them here with me, 47 pages. Two address specifically charge point operators and mobility service providers. Sorry. They have technical requirements and pricing rules. Of course, any public tender will have to take into account the AFIR rules. So indirectly, the charge point operators will be confronted with those rules when they want to take part in tenders. The next question, AFIR or Ladesäulenverordnung. We largely know the Ladesäulenverordnung, the ordinance on charge points in Germany, which has evolved over the time and which has imposed certain obligations regarding public charge points. Basically, the regime of Article 20 of the AFIR replaces the LSV in Germany. And if I understand correctly, the AFIR is somewhat more demanding in terms of payment mechanisms and for ad hoc charging. And the mechanisms overall are a little bit different from the Ladesäulenverordnung, but the largest part is not really new. A very interesting point that goes beyond the mere obligations that we can read from the AFIR and from the Q&A that were provided are the pricing rules. Article 5, which addresses the CPOs and the MSPs, sets out the principle of non-discrimination in pricing. Subparagraph 3 says no discrimination in price between end users and MSPs, nor between different MSPs is allowed. Exception, the level of prices may be differentiated, but only if the differentiation is proportionate and objectively justified. So we have two very vague open notions which need to be filled, and you need to find good reasons to differentiate. There may be objective reasons, but you have to think about it. So this rule comes along in a quite innocent way, it sort of sometimes restricts a little bit. It may affect general terms and conditions, and there is no real sanction regime, but of course competition law is applicable, and if somebody does not comply, then competition law may kick in, but only at a quite high level. So this was the part for Germany, and we found it interesting to bring in a colleague from a developed EV nation, Norway, which is not a car building country either, so that has a bit different aspect, and it's also a country outside the EU. So I'm happy to hand over to Thea.
Thank you very much. So first of all, to introduce myself, my name is Thea Tyvold. I'm a partner and lawyer here at CMS Norway. I'm based in Oslo. I will give you a little outlook from the Norway perspective. I thought I'd start with some comments on the current status. Mr. Groll from Ionity has already mentioned a bit, so this will be very brief, but it is a quite developed market for charging of electric vehicles in Norway, at least when it comes to the private cars or the passenger cars. So followers of the electrive newsletter would know that Norway has the most electric cars per person. I think this figure is still valid. About a fourth of all passenger cars on the roads are now fully electric. I think this year, 90% of the new sales of passenger cars are electric vehicles so far this year. So also the charging network is quite well established for smaller cars. And this is described as a mature market. So key players, CPOs would be Recharge, Ionity, Circle K, Tesla, to mention some. But there's still a need for further rollout of publicly available HPCs. And there's the geographical differences are there in the coverage. For trucks, heavy duty, there's a much longer way to go. So we have some smaller trucks, 12% of new smaller trucks sold are electric, but we have started seeing larger electric vehicles on the roads. But there are barely any public charging stations for heavy-duty trucks. So the logistics companies do have their own private charging on their sites, but that's kind of it. So therefore, the government EV strategy for charging is very much focused on the rollout of heavy-duty trucks and high power chargers for these vehicles. So yes, that's a key takeaway from the EV charging strategy. It's quite an ambitious strategy, but it's also pointing out how should the market and the public sector make this happen. And the charging infrastructure for long haul and heavy duty trucks is really seen as a prerequisite for the transition for this sector. So the strategy paper is very clear that the charging points rollout for these vehicles need to be positioned even more strategically to be relevant. Typically at rest areas for drivers, etc., where the trucks stop for driver rest anyway. Okay, so very briefly on the national regulatory framework, I thought that could be useful. We do have currently an Act on Alternative Fuels Infrastructure. It's largely based on the EU directive from 2014. So this will be familiar to most of you. This is what's currently the case in the EU countries as well. There are some national additions and amendments to this. For example, there's already a requirement in place to have card payment options for new charging points, and this has been in place since 2023. So this would cover parts of the AFIR as well. The Energy Act is also a key framework. It's regarding mainly licenses for grids and electricity. So generally, there's no need for a special license under the Energy Act for charging points. However, because there's an exemption for charging points for electric vehicles from the trading license requirements. But in some cases, you do need a license to own and operate the network stations. That means the transformers that you need for the charging points, if this is to be owned by the operator. As Ionity has touched upon in their presentation, it differs a bit in the different regions, also in Norway, how this is done and what the technical solutions and requirements from each grid provider is. So normally the transformers would be owned by the grid provider, but sometimes the grid provider doesn't offer the right technical solution, and then this has to be installed and owned by the operator of the charging points, and then they would also need a license, which complicates things a little bit. Planning and Building Act is also important, so you need a building permit for the charging points in general. Okay, so the main hurdles that we see and that we hear from our clients in the charging markets for establishing new charging points is, I think, access to land and grid connection. And we do recognize the aspects mentioned by Ionity and Mr. Grohl as well. In Norway, grid connection is an issue. There's a first come, first served principle. There's generally no priority for green activities, etc. So, and we do see lack of capacity in many areas. So this is familiar from many European countries. It's also the case in Norway. It may take a long time before grid connection is in place. The process can be a bit unpredictable, and the contribution costs may be relatively high especially if you need to expand the capacity because of this charging points, etc. So this is a main hurdle. Access to land is also a main hurdle. That's both in the cities, but also in more rural areas along the main transport routes. So the strategically good plots are not easily available. So these two main hurdles, they're not legal, but they will impact from our perspective as well. And the race to get the good plots is still going on when it comes to access to the right plots. Okay, we can go to the next slide then. Thank you. Just briefly on this aspect, to mention the implications of the new regulation for Norway. This regulation is seen to be EEA relevant. So Norway is part of the European Economic Area, and we do get a lot of the EU regulations and the legislation here as well. So this, the AFIR will be implemented in Norway. However, it does require national legislation, so it doesn't take direct effect here in Norway. When will this be in place? We're not sure. The legislator is working on it, so it hasn't taken effect in Norway yet, but it will. But it could take years. I'm not sure really. It will be interesting. So the targets on charger capacity and distance-based coverage in the AFIR are generally met when it comes to charging for lighter electric vehicles, but absolutely not for heavy-duty vehicle chargers. So this regulation will push the rollout of this, I think. And payment solutions, already mentioned, this is already partly in place, but the rest of the regulation does mean new obligations in the Norwegian markets. This will be implemented at some point. So, but we do get a little bit more time in our markets before we have to comply with these requirements. So just the final remarks here is, as you've picked up already from what I've said, there's a shortage of public charges for heavy-duty vehicles. This is the main focus. There is a funding program in place for charging hubs for heavy-duty vehicles by the State Innovation Agency, Enova, in certain relevant transport corridors, also other than the TEN-T routes. And you may apply for funding for up to 80% of the cost of establishing a charging point in this category, but it needs to be in the relevant spot, and then there are slots for different applications. So the last rounds of application closed this week, but there will be new rounds coming up, and this is interesting. And also, just to mention the last thing, the scheme also includes access to strategic land plots for the heavy-duty vehicle charging points through leases with the public road company. So that's proven to be very interesting to some of the players. Okay, so there will be new rounds, so pay attention to this. Okay, that was my part. Back to you, Gerd. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, to round this off, I would like to give a really short report on the Netherlands. I do that on behalf and in lieu of Cecilia van der Weijden, our Dutch partner in this EV task force, who unfortunately can't be with us today. But she sent me some pieces of information that I'd like to convey. What the Netherlands, as an EU country and a non-car building country, is a fairly advanced EV nation, we can say. They registered approximately 450,000 EVs last year, 278,000 plug-in hybrids, and that means an increase of 30% as compared to the previous year. And also in terms of the publicly available charge points, the Netherlands registered a 30% increase of the number of charge points compared to 22. What was also found out in a study by the Dutch Organization for Applied Scientific Research was, and I summarized this, and it meets what Thea said for Norway, that on the one hand, the AFIR targets may not be ambitious enough to give the users the right experience. Yeah? And on the other hand, they may be too ambitious compared to what is available in terms of grid access and grid capacity. Yeah, so it has these two directions, so it mirrors a little bit what Thea said for Norway. Obviously, the Netherlands have already much more than AFIR requires from them, but of course, putting in place a network that really satisfies the customer's needs and gives them a good journey all the way through is more demanding and will have to take technical hurdles. So grid congestion is a very, very serious topic also in the Netherlands. Of course, it's the same in Germany. And Markus Goll mentioned it already. Access to the grid is crucial and not always easy. I think this is a somewhat realistic and not to say pessimistic outlook to the future, and perhaps a topic that can also be discussed later on. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions whenever they come.
Thank you, Thea and Gerd. Now you two won't be in the panel discussion later, but your colleague Antje Becker-Bowley will be. So I do have one question for Thea at this point. Will the Renewable Energy Directive 3 also be adopted in Norway?
My answer, I am pretty sure it will, yes. But I'm not quite aware of the status on that.
Okay. All right. Well, like I said, you guys won't be in the discussion later. Your colleague will be, but that doesn't mean that if you viewers have any questions, you can still write them in the chat, and I will ask them in the discussion later.